Chefs Without Restaurants, episode 112 with Hanna Raskin.
So I stopped, actually I remember it was my last trip before the shutdown. So I was in San Antonio and we had, I think a review was going to run that week, or maybe a review I was going to write. And at that point, we realized there was no point in running reviews because restaurants were about to close. And I continued not to write reviews I haven't written one since. And my rationale there was, there was a number of reasons why I did that. I mean, there were some logistical reasons. One was that, like so many businesses, newspapers suffered during the pandemic. And as we kind of alluded to earlier, restaurant reviewing is expensive. So the budget was significantly cut. The most important thing is that here in South Carolina, we went back to on-premise unrestricted dining in May 2020. And so because of that, it was impossible for me to review a restaurant without possibly inciting people to go there, which in the midst of the pandemic, pre-vaccine, was like a really, really bad idea.
This is the Chefs Without Restaurants podcast with your host, Chris Spear. Each week, I'll be speaking with food entrepreneurs and people in the culinary industry. If you're interested in learning more about our organization dedicated to helping people build and grow their food businesses, look us up on the web at chefswithoutrestaurants.com and .org, and on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Chefs Without Restaurants. Now, enjoy the show. Welcome to the Chefs Without Restaurants podcast. I'm your host, Chris Spear. On the show, I have conversations with culinary entrepreneurs and people in the food and beverage industry who took a different route. They're caterers, research chefs, personal chefs, cookbook authors, food truckers, farmers, cottage bakers, and all sorts of culinary renegades. I myself fall into the personal chef category, as I started my own personal chef business, Perfect Little Bites, 11 years ago. And while I started working in kitchens in the early 90s, I've literally never worked in a restaurant. This week, my guest is Hanna Raskin. Hanna spent the past 8 years as food editor and chief critic for the Post and Courier in Charleston, South Carolina. During her time there, she was nominated for 4 James Beard Foundation Awards, winning the organization's first ever prize for local impact journalism. She recently left the newspaper to begin publishing the Food Section, a twice-weekly Substack newsletter that will bring original, inclusive, and independent food journalism to underserved cities and states across the American South. The Food Section launched on September 15th. On the show, we discuss her experiences as a restaurant reviewer, the state of dining in South Carolina during COVID, and her decision to abstain from reviewing restaurants during the pandemic. We discuss whether or not a chef or restaurateur's behavior should be considered when reviewing a place. And of course, you'll learn all about her newsletter, The Food Section. And we'd love it if you supported the Chefs Without Restaurants podcast and community. There are a few ways to help. First, if you have a business or product, we're always looking for sponsors. You can also support our existing sponsors like Savory Jobs. If you shop on Amazon, we have our own affiliate link. Or be like cool kids Matt Collins and Justin Kana and consider joining our Patreon. If nothing else, it would be great if you subscribed to the show, rated it, and reviewed it. And maybe share your favorite episodes on social media. The links to all these things are in the show notes as usual. The support means everything to me. And now, here's a word from this week's sponsor, Savory Jobs. Did you know restaurants turn over employees 4 times faster than most businesses? What if somebody created an affordable and effective hiring solution for the restaurant industry? What if there were a job site that only focused on people looking for food service jobs? What if that site only cost $50 a year to advertise for every job your restaurant needed? Forget the big corporate sites like Indeed and Monster. Our sponsor, Savory Jobs, has a job site exclusively for restaurants. The best part is, Savory Jobs only charges $50 for an entire year, and you can post all the jobs you want. And for our loyal listeners, use the code SAVORY10 and get 10% off. That's SAVORY10. So go to savoryjobs.com and discover the job site that's shaking up the industry. And remember to use SAVORY10 for 10% off. And now, on with the show. Thanks so much, and have a great week. Hey, Hanna, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm looking forward to talking to you. You are very familiar with my favorite food city in North America, so I can't wait to hear some stuff about Charleston, but also all the cool things you're working on.
Great.
So I guess we'll just jump right into it. I guess our listeners probably know you most from being a food writer, reviewer at the Post and Courier in Charleston. So can we talk about how and why you got into food writing and restaurant reviews?
Yeah, absolutely. I got into food writing through writing first. Like a lot of food writers, I went into newspapers right out of college, but wasn't writing about food. I was writing about crime, like most starter, rookie reporters. I didn't stay at newspapers all that long, at least the first time around. This was kind of before the internet, and I had these big ideas that my stories should last longer than one day. So I went to museum school, think I would design exhibits, which would have kind of a longer shelf life, so to speak, but still doing storytelling. As it turns out, once you get acclimated to the pace of a newsroom, no museum works fast enough. And the idea that your deadline is 3 or 4 years away really just blew my mind. So I didn't stay around in the museum field, but I did. I was at a master's program where I also got a master's in American history. And so I worked in a food history topic. So after that, I moved down to Asheville to lead mountain bike trips. And while I was there, the Alt Weekly needed a food writer. So by that point, I had the newspaper experience. I had some food history background, and I've been waitressing ever since high school, really. So I had some sense of how restaurants work. So I started doing this kind of work for pay in 2004 or 5, I believe.
Did you like restaurants and dining? Like, were you someone who always went to restaurants and thought they had a good palate?
Those are two different questions. Like, I don't think when I was a kid, I don't think I had any sense of what a palate was. I did not, grow up in a refined food family. I really, much more so than being renowned for my palate when I was a kid, I was renowned for my appetite. When I went off one summer in high school, I had the opportunity to do one of those homestays in France. And my host family used to invite over their friends just so they could watch me eat, because I think I was the stereotypical American in how well I cleared my plate and everybody else's. So I didn't think a lot about, having a palate at that young age, but I've always loved restaurants. That's, always been a really important thing for me.
I think being a restaurant reviewer sounds like one of those things that people think is probably more exciting and glamorous than it is, right? Like, oh, you get to go out, eat out at all these places for free and have whatever you want. So, like, is that true? And what are some kind of misconceptions about the way the whole process works?
Sure. Well, it's definitely true that people think it's a dream job. I think in part because they think the eating is all I do, when in fact, that's like a tiny little fraction of what I do. So I do enjoy going out, but when you're working as a critic, what people don't always realize is you go to every restaurant at least twice, usually 3 times, and sometimes 4. And that includes, and especially, the restaurants that don't seem all that great. So the 4th time going back to a restaurant where you're pretty sure you're going to have a bad meal is not exactly a dream for anyone, I would guess.
I never thought about that. You just kind of think about the one review that you see every week, but not thinking about all the places that aren't amazing.
Right. And because there's so many places that never get written up at all, because it's like, well, there's like nothing really happening here. So, there are plenty of unmemorable meals in between.
I don't live in Charleston, but I love Charleston. It's probably where I go the most. My sister-in-law lives down there, so we get down there every year. So I've really come to follow your writing and reviews. I don't know, not to kind of give me an idea of where to eat. I think I just like the food writing. Like, by the time I'm getting down there, I think I already know where I'm going to eat.
Sure.
But it seems to me that you're kind of a controversial person. Is that a fair assessment? Like, reading I guess like on Facebook posts, like the comment section, it seems like people either really love your stuff or have strong feelings about your writing. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I'm probably the worst person to ask because I don't pay as much attention to it, and there are a lot of people, especially in a polite Southern city, who think a lot of things that they wouldn't say to my face. So I probably don't know, but yeah, I would say polarizing is a fair descriptor.
Don't read the comment section.
I always read the comment section. And not only do I read the comment section, I usually respond to as many comments as I can.
You stopped doing reviews this past year or so, is that right?
Correct.
When did you stop doing that, and what prompted that decision?
COVID. So I stopped. Actually, I remember it was my last trip before the shutdown. So I was in San Antonio, and I think a review was going to run that week, or maybe a review I was going to write. And at that point, we realized there was no point in running reviews because restaurants were about to close. And I continued not to write reviews I haven't written one since. So whatever that was, March 10th, 2020 or whatever. So
yeah, like 16, 17 months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And my rationale there was, there was a number of reasons why I did that. I mean, there were some logistical reasons. One was that, like so many businesses, newspapers suffered during the pandemic. And as we kind of alluded to earlier, restaurant reviewing is expensive. So the budget was significantly cut. But the most important reason was, and two, I mean, there's also the idea that, like, how can you possibly review a restaurant during the pandemic? I know lots of folks have talked about this, but what they were doing was just trying to stay afloat, which is not the most interesting restaurant to review, because you're saying, like, what's this restaurant trying to do? It's trying to survive. So that's really not the fun of reviewing. But the most important thing is that here in South Carolina, we went back to on-premise unrestricted dining in May 2020. And I always have to emphasize the year because I know there are a lot of states that didn't go back until May 2021. And so because of that, it was impossible for me to review a restaurant without possibly inciting people to go there, which in the midst of the pandemic, pre-vaccine, was like a really, really bad idea. So I couldn't even review takeout, because even if I got takeout, there was no guarantee that my readers wouldn't go sit inside the dining room and sicken the workers and other guests.
That's a really interesting take, that you saw like almost like a moral obligation to protect people. I don't think that that's the stance that a lot of food writers took.
Yeah. And as I said, I mean, people were in different situations. Like my friends who write in LA, like there was only takeout. So I understand why they kept going with reviews. And I understand too, because that they were so limited out in California, I think there was a lot of creativity. We didn't see any of that because we didn't have to have any of that. So it was a very different scenario.
South Carolina in general seems like a crazy place to me. I mean, we were down there this past May, and it felt like business as usual, which to me was like weird and scary. You know, I have literally still not eaten in a restaurant since March of 2020. Like, yeah. I mean, I've got 2 unvaccinated young kids at home, and we're just trying to protect them even though we're vaccinated. But it just seems so weird that, like, yeah, last summer people were sitting inside restaurants eating.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's like shell shock when you walk by these restaurants and just see them completely full. And like, good for the owners, I guess, that they're keeping their business going, but it was just not how I was living.
It was stunning. And I think, I mean, this has been reported nationally, but of course, people who were really unhappy about mask mandates and other safety protocols knew that they didn't have to follow them here. So that's the crowd we were getting. So it was totally wild for a long time.
You don't want to wear a mask or get a vaccine? Go to South Carolina. They don't care.
Exactly. Right. I think that's their state slogan. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad at least the weather was nice when I was down there, that we were able to do takeout and some outdoor dining, Yeah,
that made all the difference. I mean, outdoor dining was very easy to do here. But it was just amazing. This was pre-vaccine, and there would be outdoor dining areas just empty and everyone sitting inside.
Weird world.
Yeah.
Well, when do you foresee, I mean, do you think once like kids and everyone are vaccinated, like when do you think it would be like a good time to go back to reviewing restaurants? And then
that's a great question. I am planning to reintroduce reviews this fall. I think, I mean, it's kind of a day by day call. When I made that, when I planned on picking up reviewing again in October, November, somewhere around there, it was before Delta had really peaked. Things obviously change all the time. But I think now there are enough people who are eating inside that I think, gosh, I mean, it's a really tough call, but I guess my growing concern now is, we know, I mean, the science shows vaccinated people are not dying the way unvaccinated people are. They're not facing the same kind of hospitalization. So we're dealing with a different kind of risk. So knowing that, I know that people are going to restaurants, and that's my job. I mean, really my job as a critic, most importantly, is to, help people make decisions about how to spend money in restaurants. And they know they're spending money. And I guess what occurred to me is this summer I was traveling around and reacquainting myself with the South after the pandemic. And, there's some restaurants out there that are doing a really lousy job. There's some that are doing a really pretty great job. And when I think about, I mean, yes, we want to be sympathetic to all those in the industry and everything that, all those that have suffered. But I think too of the school teachers and the healthcare workers who have gone through so much, and they deserve to have a great night out. And I feel like if restaurants aren't delivering it to them right now, it's probably time for reviewing to start again.
You don't see any kind of leniency period then, I guess, when you're going back to reviewing. Like, it's just, because right now it's so hard, right? Like, everyone talks about labor shortage and everything.
Yeah.
But at what point do we decide that, like, they need to be operating at, back to normal, back to normal is hard. But, like, if you're paying the same price, like, if I go to a restaurant and their entree is $35 today and it was $35 a year ago,
right?
Like, how much slack should we be cutting them, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Right. I mean, yes, we, always, and this is true whether we're in pandemic conditions or not. I mean, as a critic, you have to be cognizant of the circumstances, surrounding a restaurant and its operation. So yes, I mean, we know that like the supply chain is totally screwed up right now. There are some things that are absolutely beyond a restaurant's control. But a restaurant that hasn't gotten word that like they should be paying their employees a little bit more and hasn't made those adjustments, that, I think the forgiveness is not going to last long on that front.
And then I guess that brings me to another question, which is how much should we be thinking about the way a restaurant runs and who the operators are in the context of a review? I mean, in this day and age where it seems like there's more and more places where, I don't know, the chef was harassing employees. Like, does that weigh in at all? I know Eater was like not reviewing places at all if it seemed that someone who was running their operation or the chef there, was a bad actor. What's your take on that?
So, I mean, my feeling is this. I've been a reporter long enough to know that to prove those kind of allegations takes a ton of work. I mean, if you look at, even when it's something everybody has heard, I think what it take the Seattle Times 2 years to put together its story on Eduardo Jordan, it's like you can't prove this stuff overnight. And it's, I absolutely believe in listening to every allegation, taking every accusation seriously. But I'm also well aware that especially when women or people of color are in power, people are likely to try and take them down, potentially with accusations that aren't true. And so what I'm getting at is you really can't base anything on rumor. It's just, you can't do it. You need to report this stuff out. So yes, I listen, but I'm not going to strike a restaurant from consideration if nothing's been proven. I just, when it takes 2 years to do that and I'm putting out a review a week, you can't do it. You can't do it.
And then I feel like the news cycle is so short that people have forgotten, like, are anyone talking about Eduardo Jordan or anything anymore? I feel like that was a million years ago and it was like maybe 2 months ago at most.
Yeah. So that, right, exactly. You're right. There is a very short attention span on things like that. However, when something is absolutely proven, and I used to work in the Seattle market, I don't now, so I don't know how that's played out. But for instance, there is a restaurateur in the Charleston area who has been sued multiple times in connection with sexual assault. There have been, I won't go through all the court cases, but once it gets to court, once it's, the police get involved, absolutely. I won't forget about that, even if the public do. So for instance, that person's restaurants never once appeared in the food section of the newspaper here when I was running it in any context. That's easy. But I would say beyond like the workplace, toxic workplaces and abuse and assault of, employees potentially, what you can do is you certainly can assess some of the behaviors on display. So for instance, what I'm getting at here is during the heart of the pandemic, I gave out a set of awards to restaurants that were really doing a good job on the safety front because there were so many that weren't. And I thought that was really important to draw attention to that. To me, that was immoral, some of the things that were happening here in terms of the danger they were exposing their staff and guests to. So that kind of thing, I will always take stock of. It doesn't matter, how good the muscles are if I think the business practices are questionable in that regard.
I like that. It's kind of like parenting kids. Like I have two kids. So sometimes, when my daughter's doing something really good that we would love my son to do, we reward her instead of, kind of yelling at him and just say, hey, great job.
Yep. Yep.
Well, you left your job at the paper to start your own thing, and I would really love to talk about that. So now you have a Substack newsletter called The Food Section. Do you want to talk about that for a while?
Absolutely. So the idea behind the food section is to do what I was doing in Charleston, which is to cover food and beverage, industry, culture, and anything else related to eating and drinking, but rather than restrict my coverage area to Charleston, to cover the entirety of the South. So it's kind of, all the states where you drink sweet tea, kind of, it's like 10 states.
How north is the South in your opinion?
Well, there are some states that are split, right? Like, parts of Maryland are Southern, parts of, right? Like parts of Ohio were probably Southern.
I live in Maryland outside of DC, and I'm originally from the Boston area, and people talk about this as the South. And I was like, I don't know. When I was living up in the Boston area, I never would have thought of this as the South.
No, I wouldn't count DC, but partly, it's convenient for me not to count DC because I don't need to compete in that market. Like the whole idea behind this initiative is that there are so many underserved communities where there should be food journalism happening, but isn't. The Post does a great job. I don't need to be in DC, but there are plenty of places in Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee where they don't have that kind of coverage and they need it.
So, you're going to go out and find all these fun, cool stories that we don't know anything about. Is that right?
That's my hope. Yeah.
And when did you conceive of this? Like, when did you know that this was a project you wanted to take on?
It's something I've been toying with for a while, just because, again, like I felt like the work I did here was really well received by readers, as you said earlier, not all readers. But actually the idea, like, it doesn't bother me any if people, don't like what I say or don't like me at all. It's funny. I actually just got an email from someone out of state saying they had a funny story about a certain person, and I had to Google the name, and it's like, oh, that's a restaurateur who banned me from his restaurant. Like, it doesn't even. I don't care at all. So anyway, so the point is, it's fine if people don't like me, but the idea is to get people talking, and I think I was successful in doing that here. So. It seemed, I was like, look, I could do this in more places. It wasn't possible to do that under the auspices of the paper. So Substack actually put out a call, like looking for local journalists who needed financial support to get something started. So I applied to that and they gave me a grant. I had completely forgotten I had applied until they did give me a grant and decided to run with it.
And not everyone knows what Substack is, but it's a newsletter that there's both free and paid options, right?
Yeah. So every Substack publisher can structure it however they like. So my newsletter is currently free because I want folks to see what's happening with it. But by the end of October, early November, it will primarily be behind a paywall. All the free subscribers will receive is just a short email saying, here's all the stuff you missed.
Man, paywalls are a hot topic on Twitter, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's fun to have everything fully accessible, but good journalism costs money. So
yeah, I totally understand. Like, you have to pay your bills somehow. I don't know how people don't understand that. Myself, I've done some independent writing for publications, both free and paid, and it's a ton of work, and I'm a super amateur. And it's like, wow, I put all this time in to write this 1,000-word piece, and yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to undervalue it. You don't want to give it away. And my goal ultimately is to build the food section, to build it into a platform for other journalists. Like, it's fun for me to bounce from state to state, but it's better to have people on the ground. But I got to pay them. I really believe in paying people what they're worth. So that's what money buys.
I think we had talked about, even like at some point, didn't you and I talk about like food festivals and free food and that kind of stuff a couple of years ago?
Sure.
I feel like.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's one of my like hot topics is, you're having this event that someone's making money off of, and you can't give a single dollar a head to the cooks who are providing the food and labor. Ridiculous.
Right. And the food.
Yeah, and the food especially.
Yeah. Right.
Well, I think this is so interesting because it's not just restaurant reviews, it's food writing. Like when you're writing reviews about restaurants in Charleston, I wouldn't always read them because it doesn't pertain, but now you're doing some real interesting food writing that I think is universal that everyone can enjoy and hopefully get something out of.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, and that's really been fun to think about a wider audience. I think a lot of what I did in Charleston probably was applicable to a wider audience, but, now making sure that it is, it's a fun exercise.
And I just read the friends and family piece yesterday. I thought that was really great. And, something I had never even really thought about. And these are the things that I think in the food industry, more people need to be talking about. For those listening who don't know, I think you should check that out. But it's a piece on, when places open and have a friends and family dinner and the cost and the bottom line. And is it something that everyone should be doing? What prompted you to write that piece?
So as I had said, I think in the header to that piece, I had never gone to a friends and family dinner. They are a huge part of kind of the social scene here in Charleston because we have so many restaurant openings and so many well-capitalized restaurants opening. So, it's like every place is going to have some big, shindig at the start. I've never gone because I don't accept free food as a rule. So it gets difficult when they're not handing out checks. Additionally, I mean, you can say that if you're reviewing a restaurant, you could say like, well, my early experience has no bearing on what I'm going to say, when I visit in 6 weeks. I don't really trust myself on that. Like, honestly, I think humans are human. And I think if I had a horrible experience, I think on some level, I'd probably be biased. I think it would just color my impressions. So I don't go early to restaurants. And look, I don't go to this private stuff. Like, I think hobnobbing is not, that's not my job. My job is to represent and serve the general public. So I never felt comfortable going to one of those events. I've never been to one. But then I had this restaurant recovery series that I launched in August of last year, where every week I was checking in with 4 local restaurants that were taking a different approach to the pandemic. One was kind of acting like it didn't exist. One was an existing restaurant that had shut down, was kind of waiting it out. One was a new restaurant that still hadn't opened. They were supposed to open the week that it all started. And the 4th restaurant was one that made some pretty radical adjustments to its operations. So each week I'd check in, see how they were doing, what if they were going to make it. Interestingly, when I started this in August 2020, I didn't think any of them would make it. I thought they would all close eventually. They all stayed open, including the one which had never opened. They just ran takeout throughout the pandemic. And then they were opening in June. And after all those months together, they invited me to their friends and family. Yeah, okay, this makes sense from a reporting standpoint. I've seen them all the way through. So I went to the friends and family, and I was just astonished. I mean, people were like ordering off the wine list and order everything on the menu. And it's like, why would you do this to these people? Like, this is so expensive. And what is the point? And that's really what I wanted to find out. I was like, what is the point? So, as I said in the piece, I just think now as we're reevaluating every aspect of the restaurant business, this seemed like one worthy of scrutiny.
Yeah, I've never opened a restaurant, and I just think people spend a ridiculous amount of money on crazy stuff that I would never do. And I'm and when I have those opinions and put them out there, people always want to argue. It's like, okay, but did you need $500 chairs or $10,000 chairs or whatever? Like, it just does not seem like a good business decision.
Right. And I get it. Like, again, with starting this newsletter, I'm starting a business for the first time. And I get it that a lot of these decisions are difficult. We're like, okay, I'm putting in, this much money here and that much money there. And like, what's going to make the most sense for the people I serve in the end? And you don't always know, but these friends and family dinners really seem like a mess.
Well, that's why I think I had responded to you on Twitter. I'd said, we had one here in town that I got invited to. And part of the process is they want to teach their staff how to, deliver a check and everything. So they actually present the table with the full check. Now, they let you know this is comped if you want, but like anything you want to put towards the bottom line would be appreciated. And I thought that was great. I mean, and my wife and I still paid the full bill because I just wanted to go check it out. I thought it was cool to go and see what the restaurant was about, but I wasn't going to walk out and be like, oh, $200 free dinner.
Right. I mean, and so that's what I tried to allude to in the piece, or maybe even said explicitly, like this really plays into the idea of the public sense of entitlement when it comes to restaurants. And that, this was especially true, as we all remember, immediately after vaccines, right? And people were going back to restaurants, and we remember all those stories about how people were treating restaurant employees. And I had spoken to, I can't remember what made this person an expert. I don't know what line of work they were in, but saying that the theory was that restaurants had been so flexible and adaptable throughout the pandemic that people walked back in and were like, wait a second, like you're a, French bistro that just became a coffee shop. So if I want pistachio ice cream, go make me some. It's like, you can do it all. And I think that's just such an unhealthy attitude. I mean, I think, of course, restaurants have to be hospitable, but restaurants patrons also have to understand how to receive hospitality. And so, yeah.
Yesterday, maybe, I think I saw on like their Instagram, Bon Appetit, or someone said like the 10 new rules of dining out. Did you see that?
I saw it on Instagram and I didn't click on it. But I was going to go back.
I just went through really quickly. I think the first one is like the customer isn't always right. But just, basically like it's time for us to all take a step back and think about like what it means to go out to a restaurant, what everyone is going through, not just you as a consumer. And like maybe here's some tips to be a better customer when you go out to eat.
Right. Because it's not too much of a stretch from saying like to the waitress. I mean, I was a restaurant server forever to say like, oh, why don't you smile when you talk to me? To, during the pandemic, why don't you take your mask off so we can, it's like, okay, now you're putting people's lives at risk. Like that customer is not right. And I am glad that there are a number of restaurant owners who have empowered their employees to take a stand in those.
Which is hard because I don't think you should, some of these things have turned to altercations, both loud and sometimes physical. And it's like, like that's just not a position anyone needs to be in. Like the whole thing with who's checking vaccination records at the door. Like you're going to put a 18-year-old hostess at the door checking this guy's card to make sure he can come in here. Like, I don't know. It's a tough spot to be in.
Right. I don't think there's any restaurant in Charleston that's restricted to vaccinated people.
Oh, I'm in the land of like I'm in the land of vaccinated everything. Like you want to go here to this concert, you got to have your vaccination card. You want to go to this restaurant, you got to have your vaccination card.
Great.
So bizarre.
So it's a whole other world here. It really is. I mean, it was so strange just on social media. Like you'd hear from these other cities and states and you're like, oh my God, like they are literally living in a different world.
Yeah. So how do you plot out your trip when you're thinking about what you're going to be writing? Do you already have a good chunk of your time mapped out already of where you're going? And I guess when you get there, like how many pieces are you writing when you go to a specific place?
Yeah, good question. I mean, it kind of depends what I'm going for. I would say generally, if I'm going somewhere, I'm going to report one story that I've already done some legwork for, and I know that story is going to come together. I just need to, sit down with one person or visit one restaurant or whatever. And then I would probably try and scout other stories while I'm there. So it would be sort of secondary reporting. But you do give yourself a little time for the serendipity of like, oh, I wasn't expecting this to happen. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I kind of started this whole adventure in July. I took this 3-week train trip around the South for just that reason. I wasn't reporting any story at all. And in fact, I hadn't planned to even like write about the train trip because I was like, I'm just out here looking. But then everyone wanted to hear about the train trip. So I wrote about the train trip. It's interesting though, as I think I said in that piece, when you travel during the pandemic, there is less serendipity. Like things are more planned, things are more plotted. I just didn't have as many finds as I feel like I might have in a freer time. But I did come back with a long story list. And so, yeah, I mean, I try, like, the idea is that this newsletter will, as the name says, be newsy, so I don't want to, be too wedded to any schedule. But I do have like the next, 3 months kind of planned out. And you're releasing, what, twice a week? Is that right? Twice a week. So idea is like one big story drops on Monday, which could be, an investigative piece, a review, an opinion piece. What you mentioned about friends and family, that was a Monday piece, something that just takes up a topic of general interest. And then Wednesday is just kind of like a little roundup, short columns, short news items, things like that. Do you have any favorite pieces that you've written over the years? Like, does anything stand out that you're really proud of? One of the things I was really, really proud of was the last piece I wrote for the Post and Courier here, which is a document that's just been sitting in the University of South Carolina library that nobody really has looked at. And it was part of the Negro Writers Project, which was part of the New Deal Writers Project program. In the South, those programs were segregated. So there were just under a dozen contributors to what was called, again, the Negro Writers Project, including a woman who essentially reviewed restaurants in Charleston. She wrote, I think it was a 6-page guide to restaurants, Black restaurants in Charleston. And it was just kind of this fascinating document because you don't hear a lot about that period in Charleston history during the Depression. Obviously we hear lots about the Civil War, Revolutionary War. This is kind of a less well chronicled period. And so what's really great was I was able to track down her relatives who had no idea that she'd done this work and to learn about her. I mean, she was this really headstrong, very proper woman. And it was, that was a lot of fun just to think about, a part of restaurant history here in Charleston that had never really been told before.
I didn't see that. I'll have to check that out. I'm sure I can probably still find it online.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I guess on the flip side of that, is there anything that stands out that's your most talked about or debated piece? Is there, have you done, I mean, I'm sure there's a few, but does anything stick out as a review you did that nobody agreed with or a large percentage of people didn't?
I don't know if I'd say nobody agreed with this. Certainly my most talked about review that I did here was of a restaurant that banned me before they were open. There was a, kind of group of restaurant industry and kind of powerful people locally who had decided that I was too powerful and they wanted to correct for that. So they had this mob meeting. Seriously, they all got together. And the strategy was, well, this new restaurant is opening. We're going to tell Raskin that she can't come and see what happens. We'll just say, we prefer not to be reviewed, which is an interesting conundrum because obviously I couldn't set the precedent and allow a restaurant to, excuse itself from reviewing. It's not up to the restaurant, but also it's a small town and there was no way of me getting in there without them knowing. So in this case, I ended up reviewing my friend's leftovers that she brought to me in boxes.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, so, I mean, we're not doing video for this right now. I have no idea what you look like. I mean, has that been challenging, the whole process of sneaking into a restaurant and people not knowing how, what you look like?
Yeah. There's no question in Charleston, people do know what I look like. It is a really small town. And so, I take so seriously, as I've said earlier, kind of, serving the readers. And so that means I do public speaking engagements. If the Kiwanis want to learn how reviews work, I'll go and tell them. So while there are not photos of me circulating that are current, there are plenty of photos of me online, but they're all really, really old at this point. People locally know who I am. So it's kind of fun now to have a larger region where that isn't always going to be the case.
Well, I appreciate that, hopefully you get a non-biased review because as a diner, I want to know that the review kind of is representative of the meal you've had. I've talked about I don't want to say the worst meal I've ever had because I've had some bad meals. The most disappointing meal I ever had was at Husk in Charleston. Mm-hmm. And it prompted me to and I'm not a Yelper. It was on my website. I waited almost a year before I wrote it. I was so mad because I think it's because I wanted to go there more than anywhere. And I had read nothing but good praise. And I went and had absolutely the worst service in my life there. And I was like, I'm not a reviewer. I don't want to be that Yelper, but I also felt like there was nothing on the internet anywhere that spoke about that kind of experience. I'm like, I'm so angry. Maybe it's because it was my anniversary dinner, but I got a cocktail and they never once asked if I wanted a second. And my empty glass sat on the table for an hour and a half and they served me a dessert with ice cream and no spoon and it's melting and I can't get a server to come over. And it was just almost laughable how bad it was. But it was it was the year they were called the best new restaurant in America, I think by Andrew Knowlton and all that. Yep. And so I was like, oh, wow, this is the best new restaurant in the country. And I can't get a spoon for my melting ice cream. And,
Yeah, I'm totally with you. Husk is really interesting. Husk is a restaurant that wouldn't say it was a victim of positive press, but it certainly had so much of it that it got to be when I was speaking to the Kiwanis or Rotary Club or whatever, invariably someone would come up to me after my speech and say, which restaurant I hate? And I would say Husk. Every time. The local backlash against Husk is intense. And I think for the very reason that you just articulated, I always thought it was that what made the locals upset about Husk was that they weren't identified as locals. They were just treated you're lucky to be here. It's interesting, that theory may not have aged well because now everyone here is a tourist. And I don't know if any restaurant still recognizes locals. It's really, some, a little. But that was really kind of at the turning point for Charleston when it went from like, oh, this, from the kind of that local to tourist shift.
Now, I will say I'm a big fan of Sean, and I did talk to the management that night, and they took care of us at McCrady's the next night. So they did make up for it in that respect. I mean, amazing recovery, but it was just like one of those things that like I go to Charleston every year, and my wife would say, we can go anywhere, but we're not going to Husk. And I was like, can't we give it like another try? Like, I really want to love this place. She's like, no, like I'm done.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it really, like I said, I think it's just because was so many accolades for it and people's expectations are so high, but there is no restaurant in South Carolina that I know of that people mention so frequently, like, that's the place I'll never go.
I also was eating in the same section as Bill Murray, and I feel like he got a little better service than I did. And it was like he had 4 servers to my half a server. So,
Right. That's a local who still gets the local treatment.
Yeah. I guess, if I was in Ghostbusters, different story.
Right.
Well, do you have a favorite restaurant down in Charleston? I mean, can I put you on the spot? Is it too hard to pick one? Or I guess say like, if you only had one meal, like if you were going to go back and have one meal, where would that be?
Gosh, I mean, it I guess it depends what the meal is. I'm a huge fan. Gosh, it's really, really hard to choose. Okay. I guess if I were to go away, I mean, one of the restaurants I would miss most is Bertha's Kitchen, which is a soul food restaurant in North Charleston. It's been recognized now as like, as a Beard America's classic. It's just, it's woman owned and run. And the food is fantastic. That's where you go for soup and red rice and all that. So I would really miss Bertha's. In terms of like new wave high-end restaurants, the things that Charleston gets written up for primarily, I really emerged from the pandemic such a believer in Edmund's Oast, which is
number one restaurant for me.
Yeah, really. I just went on Friday night. I had like, why would I don't know if I had like a hard week or something. I was like, no, let's just go to Edmund's Oast. It not only is the food great, and they have this phenomenally talented pastry chef now as well, and the wine list is really good. The bar's always been fantastic. I mean, it's great. Everything about it is great, but they were just total leaders during the pandemic in terms of taking care of their people, taking care of their staff, taking care of their guests. I know so many people who wouldn't eat anywhere else. It was the safest place in Charleston. And they were
amazing outdoor dining space.
Amazing outdoor dining space. They were creative, and just so caring. They initiated back, when this wasn't happening, they had weekly COVID testing for any hospitality employee in the city. They're like, we got to fix this thing, which I was really impressed by. So.
I know they've had chefs there over the years, a couple different ones, but I'm a big fan of Bob Cook and everything Bob's done and where he's been. And when he moved in there, I was like, yeah, this just is the icing on the cake to make it my favorite place. I'm already a big beer guy.
Yep.
So we end up, and it's fun. Like we take the kids there. There's always stuff for the kids to eat and.
Completely. I mean, it's as I said, a lot of people who were smart weren't eating anywhere else.
And I know you just started this new project, but do you have anything else on the horizon or is this enough for now?
Oh, other things I'm doing? This is pretty much it right now. I'm trying to see if I'm working on anything else. I mean, anything I'm doing, I'm trying to kind of fold into this. So anything new I come up with, you can find in the Substack, I'd say.
Yeah, no pressure to start a new business, but sometimes people have multiple irons in the coals.
Right.
Whose food writing do you love?
Boy, I'm a really big fan of Brett Martin. I think he's such a good writer. I read his pieces multiple times. I think he's just terrific. What other food writing? Now I'm looking around. You can't see because we got video on, but I'm looking around at my bookcases to see who else I've been reading. I mean, I try to read from different eras and different places. It's really fun. I had the opportunity a few years ago to go to India and to meet some food writers there. And I don't know if I would say like everyone should seek out this food writing, but it's so much fun to read, food writing from a different culture. It's a different approach, different voice. So I enjoy that. I try and read everyone. It's a small world, so we all know each other.
Yeah, it's like chefs trying to eat at all the chef restaurants.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Was there anything else you want to get into before we get out of here today?
I don't think so. This has been great. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, and I usually kind of end with a question like, if you had to describe yourself as a flavor, what would it be?
Describe myself as a flavor. I mean, I think, I really like horseradish, which I think is like, right, like I'm going to go with horseradish, right? Because some people find it hard to take, but I think it, makes things more lively.
Ah, I love that. And I love horseradish.
Yum.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show. I'm going to link everything in the show notes. People will be able to find your new writing, maybe some interesting old pieces, and where they can find you. What's the best place to reach out to you on the internet if people want to get in contact with you?
Yeah, I am at readthefoodsection@gmail.com. So, and I answer every email and I answer them fast. I love hearing from people. So you should be able, they can also find me on Twitter or Instagram if they don't remember the email address, but I'd love to hear from folks.
Great. I'll put that in the show notes. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yay. Thank you, Chris. This is really fun.
And to all of our listeners, this has been Chris with the Chefs Without Restaurants podcast. As always, you can find us at chefswithoutrestaurants.com.org and on all social media platforms. Thanks so much and have a great day. Thanks for listening to the Chefs Without Restaurants podcast. And if you're interested in being a guest on the show or sponsoring a show, please let us know. We can be reached at chefswithoutrestaurants@gmail.com. Thanks so much.